Good evening, everyone. Or I should say Kaya and Wanju. Before I actually explain proceedings tonight, as if you didn't all know why you were here, I'm going to ask for Auntie Robin Collard to come up and provide our welcome to country. Thank you.
Good evening, my name is Robin Collard Rioli and I'm a Yorga of the Whadjuk and Balladong people. I'm one of many traditional owners and custodians of this land, and I'm humbly honoured to perform this welcoming ritual and would like to acknowledge with the highest respect Nyunga Mam and Ngunis, our men and brothers, Yorgas and Juk, our women and sisters, elders, Mort, any family who may be here this evening, and of course our Brudias, our leaders, and in particular to Mr. Fred Chaney. There are three principles that are of utmost importance to Noongar people: our connection to land, our family and our knowledge, that is, ngala buja, ngala mort, ngala karijan. In our gathering, it is extremely important to remember our ancestors who have walked this land for many thousands of years. Their spirit still lingers. Their story still lingers. We honour them. Kaya, Wanju Wanju nunakan kwabarak nyunga buja, kedalak nunakan kuling nija wadaran, Burulu, Margara, Derbil Yerrigan, Walyalak, Wadaran, Wajima, Derbil Nara, Bir, Jalgara, Karamurda, Mandun, Jundala, Margara, Nija, Karagara, Borulu. All of these very special places that I have just mentioned are significant to Noongar Whadjuk people. I say them now, their English name: Perth, the Swan River, Kings Park, Fremantle, the ocean, Wajima, Coburn Sound, the Beelia, the fresh water that runs under this ground, Canning River, and then we come to the foothills of the Darling Ranges, Mandun, out at Guildford, and then of course we go further north to Joondalup, that connects the story of the Charnock woman Nija. And then we come back to Perth and Margara, where the river crossing used to come up to the top of your leg, and Noongar people would cross the river from side to side at this time. Nija jinag mama wakolwa, karijan wankaning wiran buja, bona wankaning balap court, cart, mindich. Ngang nija court European buja. Welcome to the sacred ground and the home of the rainbow serpent, the creator of the Noongar dreaming, the land, the language, the knowledge that belongs to this land. I bring the eucalyptus leaves, as they have special healing qualities when our hearts, minds and bodies are sick. Ngalak ni wankaning, Boola Bardip, buja. We listen to the many stories of this land as it speaks to us in different ways. Jeran nija, Jiljit nganing bui nija, Zamia koya manyit. Maya wa, nija, waka. Jeran is the season of adulthood in the Noongar calendar, covering the months of April and May. The winds are coming from the south, it's cooler. And at this time of the year, those beautiful red flowers are around everywhere. The seed cones are forming on the trees. In the past, Noongar woman, she would find the seeds of the zamia nut, rush them through the water, grind the seeds when they are cleaned to make the damper, to sit around Karl, the campfire, and share the food and kep, the water, and share the stories, Nijawankani. Yongas were hunted for their skins so that we could make blankets. Our maya-mayas at this time of the year, made out of the paper bark, would be refurbished and made sound for the wet winter season of Makaroo. Murich Wirran, Murich Ngat, Nunuk Mar. Strong hearts, strong spirits, as the beautiful stories bring their life-giving skills and people. Kedla Kura Winyan Bunich Nija. There's a time when we are humbled and on our knees, whether that be through sickness or sorrow. Nonok Murdich, but you are strong and solid. Kwap Wirran Kulin, Waranka, Nonok and Court Yakai King. So we ask that the positive energy be here this evening to celebrate the stories of Mr. Chaney. And I reckon there's a lot of stories out there. And so for me, Nunakan Murit Mama Nija, Wankani, Kura, Nija Jenabidi Wajak Puja. For many years, those stories have been shared on this land. And my father used to work with Mr. Chaney for many years. When Reconciliation first started all those years ago, and again with Sir Ronald Wilson, who handed me my first undergraduate degree at Murdoch University. So, very special people. And I'm sure we could all share a story. I can remember once when I was working at Catholic Education and we invited Fred Chaney in, and he was very forthright. And he used some very colourful language that I could never repeat. So I'm just wondering if some of those memoirs are in this story. Yunka, thank you.
Thank you, Auntie Robin, for that welcome. Apart from the flight around Wajak country, you always educate, and there's always a bit of humour, and we get to reflect on where we are and what we're doing here in this special week, National Reconciliation Week, as we prepare to honour a special man, special to all of us. My name's Gary Smith. I'm one of the co-chairs of Reconciliation WA, and I welcome you all tonight to our very special Fireside National Reconciliation Week event, the launch of Reconciliation Memoirs with Fred Chaney, in conversation with Victoria Laurie. So I welcome you here. I would also like to start by paying my respects to the Wajak Noongar people as the custodians of the land on which we're on today, this special land, and to acknowledge their respect and sustenance of language, song and culture for all Australians. I'd like to pay my respect to elders past and present, and to acknowledge any Aboriginal people, any Torres Strait Islander people that are here with us tonight. Fred tonight will share his reflections this evening in a fireside yarn with past Western Australian Treasurer Ben Wyatt, a Noongar man who reached the highest level of office in state government. So at the outset, I make a very, very warm welcome to the Honourable Fred Chaney AO, the Honourable Ben Wyatt, and also to the talented Victoria Laurie, who's here with us tonight as the author. I'd also like to comment that my fellow co-chair, Carolina, sends her apologies for tonight. She would dearly have loved to have been here, but unfortunately, like many of us, she has been impacted by COVID. She's asked me to send my best wishes to Fred and Ben and Victoria, and to welcome you all. On behalf of the Reconciliation WA Board and the team, we're delighted to have you all here, both in person and many people that are streaming online. As part of our acknowledgements, I'd also like to make a special welcome to Karen Mundine. Welcome, Karen, the CEO of Reconciliation Australia, who has flown in to be with us today. It's great to have you here with us. This is the third year in a row you've been with us, so thank you very much for your support. The publishing of this important memoir was made possible by Reconciliation Australia and Wesfarmers. I thank you both for supporting our vision to capture important reconciliation stories and welcome you and your leadership and guests here this evening. I noticed Alan Kransberg in the audience. Thank you, Alan, and also Naomi Flutter, representing Wesfarmers. Thank you for your support. I acknowledge our valuable partners who are here with us tonight, whose contribution and support are vital to the creation of this year's NRW program, and they consist of BHP, Woodside, St John of God Healthcare, and our major supporter, Lottery West. And of course, as we sit in the foyer of the WA Museum, I'd like to highlight the support and the generosity of our event partner, WA Museum Boola Bardip and their team, and to acknowledge that they've been with us all week and supporting national reconciliation. And I'll especially acknowledge the Chair, Melissa Park, and particularly CEO Alec Coles and the Acting CEO, Di Jones. Thank you for supporting us with this venue. I did tell my wife that don't worry, you don't have to rug up, we'll be inside. I didn't realise what foyer meant, but anyway, we'll deal with that later. I'd also like to acknowledge the Directors General here across multiple state departments. I won't name you all. And also a special visit from Shelley Rays. Where is Shelley? Down the front there. Shelley's here and was Fred's inaugural co-chair at Reconciliation Australia all those years ago, so it's great to have you here. Very importantly, a very special welcome to half the audience, the Chaney family members, and particularly to you, Angela. Welcome, as always, who are here celebrating this special event with us this evening. And without being too political, a special welcome for Kate Chaney, recently elected independent member for Curtin. So congratulations, Kate, and welcome. And now to the main event. So as you both come forward, if I could ask you to come to the stage, both Fred and Ben, I'll acknowledge that Fred needs little introduction to the reconciliation community, so I'll make a little introduction now then. He's certainly a long-standing champion of the movement. As the inaugural non-Indigenous co-chair of Reconciliation Australia, Fred served on their board for 15 years, 5 as co-chair, shepherding in a next era of reconciliation. When commissioning these memoirs, Fred was retiring from our board here in Western Australia, the Reconciliation WA board, of which he was a founder from 2012. And that prompts me to also recognise our board members here today, just because I just thought Fred shares that founding status with another board member here, Irena Catalini. So thank you for your support over the years too, Irena. So he's a founder of the Reconciliation WA board, but he continues his passion as he steps down, or as he has stepped down, his passionate pursuit of justice and equality for Aboriginal people. We're indebted to you, Fred, for your service on our board, where you brought great insight, intelligence, humility, a bit of humour, and some of that language to the conversations, which is always welcome. I also appreciate past State Treasurer Ben Wyatt joining us here this evening, which I'm sure will create a rich conversation, a couple of debates. If you don't actually keep us enthralled, we're going to have to get up and do some calisthenics halfway through tonight, I think, so there's a challenge for you. I'd also like to acknowledge that this evening's event is being live streamed to our online audience, so welcome to you all. So what are we doing tonight? Our event will commence with a conversation between Fred and Ben, followed by a 20-minute question and answer period. Hopefully that'll be a lively set of questions. There'll be a roving microphone, one for the Cheneys, one for the rest of us, here with us live. And for those of you online, please feel free to put your questions into the online chat box and we'll monitor that. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the proceedings over to Ben and Fred. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Gary. Clearly, I was given the sanitised version of the memoirs because there was certainly no bad language in my version.
Just wait,
Fred.
just wait.
But good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. The person I will acknowledge, of course, Robin Collard for her welcome, and I thank you, Robin, for celebrating Noongar culture here with us this evening. Fred, I'm going to get straight to it. We've got a short period of time, and as we found out yesterday, we both can talk. You say in Victoria Laurie's book that the journey of reconciliation is a historical movement that ebbs and flows, but its trajectory is inevitable, and for that you take great solace. I'm just going to put a quote to you before I bowl up question one, and that is, at one point you make the point around politics. Politics is, and I quote, what you try to achieve, what's the best possible answer, not the right answer, but the least bad one. We now have a freshly elected Commonwealth government that has nailed its colours to the mast very strongly with what it intends to do with, certainly in its first term, the first one pillar of the Uluru Statement. And I guess, how do you see that playing out? How do you see the Parliament creating a voice with that legitimacy and authority to speak on behalf of Aboriginal people?
Well, it's not a simple matter, because one of the things that I've most often heard is Aboriginal people say, that person doesn't speak for me. So getting a national voice which is seen by the great diversity of Aboriginal peoples across Australia as being an authentic voice for them is not a simple matter, but a huge amount of the work's been done. And I think one of the very useful things that Ken Wyatt leaves as his legacy is the work that was done on the co-design process. And that really adopted views that were put by a whole series of Aboriginal interests, but not least by Cape York, that what was essential is the voice had to come up from the bottom to represent that great diversity of voices. So I think that's going to be the real challenge in putting this together in a way which leads us having a national voice that is firmly based in local and regional voices.
And Fred, with a referendum, bearing in mind where politics has been, and again, I'll quote you, I'm not going to quote it all because of course you'll have to go buy the book in due course. I felt lucky, this is in your reflection in respect of working with Neville Bonner, former senator, I felt lucky to be around at the right time because I found myself with parliamentarians who thought about politics in a different way, people who let the facts speak for themselves and did not regard political advantage as their starting point. And so I guess looking at your journey, we think there's some of the great names of particularly the legal fraternity who have supported reconciliation. Can a referendum be successful?
I think it can, and I think we're at a point of great opportunity. I look back to the mid-1970s when we had a very turbulent political period. You'll recall the dismissal of Whitlam was a sort of high point crisis, if you like, in politics. But in that year, the Parliament was able to deal with racial discrimination, it dealt with land rights, it dealt with family law, it dealt with difficult topics, and that's because politicians were able to talk to each other in a sensible way and, as I say, look at the facts and try and get the best answer. With this newly elected Parliament, I think there's this huge opportunity. Each of the major parties got about a third of the vote. The crossbench got about a third of the vote. And the Parliament is going to be a quite different Parliament. And if the government does, as the Prime Minister has indicated he wants to, if it does conduct itself differently, the Parliament has a great opportunity to become the real meeting place of ideas, a meeting place of minds, and a meeting place where people come out with solutions. And I think this issue of constitutional recognition building on the work that's been going on for a very long time now, it's just a great opportunity. This afternoon I got a call from someone in Canberra who said, "Oh, you're on television." And so I turned on National Indigenous NITV, and there was a considerably younger Fred Chaney sitting with a considerably younger Megan Davis. And we were talking in the context of the expert panel's deliberation more than, 12 years ago. And it really reminded me how long a journey this has been. It really has been going on and on and on, but that's not to say that it hasn't been a productive period. We've now got, I think, a really good plan for how to construct a national voice that will have authenticity. We've got a government that wants to give this priority. We've got a large crossbench, which I'm sure will be supportive. And we may even have an opposition which will see that this is a thing that it also should support. That door is open. I just hope it will be not slammed shut at some time, which would be very difficult.
And that, I guess, sort of flows into your particular journey. Has been quite an extraordinary one, because I've always found it fascinating that you were a WA senator representing the Liberal Party at a time when the Liberal establishment was quite hostile to Aboriginal rights. And I quite like this quote, and I think some people in this room might guess who it is, but you can tell me who said this to you, Fred. "Things are either black or white, Fred. Get out of the grey. You're always grey."
Yeah, well, that was Sir Charles Court. It was actually quite a difficult thing to be supporting land rights as a concept in the 1970s in Western Australia. It's a reminder that Australia is a very regionalised country. I mean, Queensland is very different from New South Wales, it's very different from Victoria, South Australia and Western Australia and so on. And the whole land rights movement was anathema to a lot of people in Western Australia, particularly to the Liberal Party and particularly to its leader, Sir Charles Court. And Sir Charles Court was a bit of a god in the Liberal Party. I mean, what he said went. And he wasn't a man he didn't really like opposition. And so it was quite a difficult thing to handle as a member of the Liberal Party in Western Australia in that time. But the fact of the matter is it wasn't difficult nationally, because the national government and our national leader at that time, Malcolm Fraser, was very staunch. And so it was one of those many examples when in politics you have split loyalties. Your loyalty to your electorate, your loyalty to your own principles, your loyalty to your party, your loyalty to the nation. These things don't always line up. And that's why politics is such a fascinating and at times difficult game. I think we record in there, and my wife's, Angela's comments are there, that was a really tough time because my loyalties were so split. And people that I'd worked with closely for 20 years in the Liberal Party were dead opposed to the views that I had. And it was most unfortunate, but we've got past that. And I mean, the really lovely thing about living for a long time is that just a few years ago, a Liberal government led by Colin Barnett entered into the South West Land Settlement. And what an amazing thing. You, as Minister, got the Yamaji Land Settlement. But the fact of the matter, it went from being a deeply contentious thing that everyone was at odds with each other to something which was accepted. And Richard Court, the son of Sir Charles Court, was the person who facilitated the Nookumar land determination where they got exclusive possession of native title. The main thing is to live long enough, just live long enough and it all happens eventually.
Well, I like to think, Fred, that I haven't lived that long as yet, but I think my own life, there has been extraordinary change. You reflect on my dad in here, and I think his life was, his struggles, I guess, were very different to mine, so very much around the rights agenda, and I remember very well as a teenager, the fights over, that was, the sort of that post-Mabo decision and the very hostile, remember the hostile dialogue in WA in particular. And it's extraordinary now that I think Western Australia is probably, it's the native title state. It's embedded.
That's what the governor calls it.
Well, that's right. But it is actually now, it's gone from hostility to there's not a government or a company that wouldn't think at first port of call you've got to go speak to the traditional owners, which is a huge shift.
It is a huge shift, and again, there is an advantage to having a long view. I forgot to bring in something I promised to give Ben. I just got a circular report from the Sister Kate Foundation, and this report was their annual report, no, quarterly report, sorry, and it has a lot of photographs of the old days at Sister Kate's. And Angela was leafing through it and she said, "That's Cedric Wyatt." And there's a tiny little boy, a dear little cherubic boy, sitting in the front row of a group of kids. No, I knew your dad, I knew him at school, but as a little boy, he was very cherubic. And isn't that a fantastic story? You got a kid in Sister Kate's, he then went to Clontarf, he then came to Aquinas and was in the same class as me. He had children, one of them Ben, and here's Ben, been Treasurer of Western Australia, now sitting on the major company boards. But if that's not a story of Australia's progress and change, his father, we were told, was a Maltese migrant child when I was at Aquinas. And why would we be told that? We were told that because I think it would have been the judgment that if we thought he was Maltese, we'd be nicer than if we thought he was Aboriginal. I mean, that's, again, it's a mark of the change in the times. And I mean, I sort of feel I've got a vague bit of ownership in you, Ben, because you represent everything that I would hope would happen.
Fred, thank you. I'm delighted to join this massive Chaney clan that is here with us. Resplendent in teal over there. Thank you. I'm good to see you all.
Well, you noticed, of course, that already Kate has solved the global warming problem.
Thank you, Kate. It's quite chilly up here. But I just want to just dwell, again, just a little bit on native title, because I, for one, have found it, some of the companies I'm involved with now, the legitimacy of how corporate Australia operates, and bearing in mind corporate Australia, particularly the resource sector, opposed native title so vehemently.
Sure did.
Now native title actually gives those companies the legitimacy to operate. It's an incredible journey that, as I said, it's only been, 1993 was the Mabo decision, so it actually hasn't been that long to see such, what has been considered the Wild West embrace Aboriginal people.
Ben, I've got a long history with the company of which you're now a director. In the old days, when I think it was called CRA, I used to regularly go to their Melbourne offices, and this was pre-Mabo, and I had the most wonderful intellectual workouts. The people there were of very high quality, terrific people, but they were totally opposed to the notion that Aboriginal people should be allowed to get in the way. And what changed, and what changed the whole of the Australian corporate sector, was in fact the point at which, and it was your company, Rio Tinto, your now company, Rio Tinto, that led this, when they suddenly realised they weren't dealing with people who were just another caterwauling interest group, they were dealing with stakeholders. And one of the great days, I think, in Australia's journey on this was in 1995, when Leon Davis, then the chief executive, made what I think was called the sensitive New Age minor speech. And he said, we will not oppose native title, we will work with native title. Now, I'm a great fan of Leon Davis. I sometimes call him St. Louis Leon Davis because I think he played such an important role. But in truth, although I see him as something of a secular saint, I don't think his conversion was a spiritual conversion. It was the reality that he was dealing with people who had legal rights, and he had to deal with them as stakeholders. When he left to take over the top job in London, Leon made a speech in the old Parliament House, which I just happened to be there for, but he said, the last time we opened a mine under the old system of opposition was Marandoo, when we came in late and over budget. The first one we did under the new system was Yandy, and we came in early and under budget. He said, isn't it nice to do the right thing and have a commercial advantage?
Yeah, sure, as a result.
So I think the great thing is that the mining industry led the change of treating Aboriginal people as stakeholders and not as mendicants, not as supplicants. And I think that's changed Australia for the better in an enormous way.
I was interested, Fred, to hear the new opposition leader reflect on the reason. He said, you know, when he didn't stay in the Parliament for Kevin Rudd's apology, he said, yes, I think that was a mistake, and he wanted first to fix up effectively, you know, the health and education issues and disparities before there should be an apology, which brings me to closing the gap, which is, I guess, that a much harder policy agenda that governments have been not as successful as they'd like to be to this point. The reconciliation movement, I feel, has been fundamental in terms of explaining to non-Aboriginal people why it is we do need to make such an effort around closing the gap. Where do you sit now? Are you optimistic around the closing the gap agenda?
I think one of the really great contributions of the reconciliation movement, and that includes the old Council, Reconciliation Australia and bodies like Reconciliation WA, is to run the message, which I think is absolutely valid, that you must start with respectful relationships, because you can't change things for the better unless you're dealing with each other respectfully. And so that's the sort of starting point. In terms of my optimism about closing the gap, and I want to give credit to, I was not a fan of the recently deposed Prime Minister. I thought he was awful, actually. But one thing he did that I think is, you know, for which he should have credit, is that in December 2018, I think it was, he met with Pat Turner.
That's right.
And Pat Turner is the head of NACCHO. Pat was in the department when I was Minister, so she must be very old.
Just as formidable, let me tell you.
She's a fantastic person. Charlie Perkins' cousin, I think. Yeah. A terrific woman. And she got in to see the Prime Minister, and I did help a bit in that. And to Scott Morrison's great credit, he listened to what she said. What she basically said was, we're sick of you doing things to us. We've got to be doing this. We have to be in genuine partnership. And I mean, this is, I think, he may even get it to heaven on this basis. Scott Morrison actually called the department in. I only got this second hand, I wasn't there, but Pat told me. He called the department in and said, look, we've been doing this the wrong way. We're going to do it this different way. Now, from that has flowed partnerships between every level of government and the Aboriginal peaks. And the partnership says that the government will work in partnership. And you were the minister when you entered into that. And I, want to say thank you very much. It was terrific. So we're in this situation where, at least in legal theory, government's going to have to work in partnership. But the really tricky part of that is that governments aren't actually structured to work as partners. They're structured to deliver services. They're structured to tell you what to do, to make laws. And so this is a huge challenge for governments. Can they structure themselves so they can genuinely be in partnership with Aboriginal people? Because if they can't, they're not going to close the gap. You can't educate people against their will. You can't keep them healthy against their will. You can't employ people against their will. It actually involves the agency of the people themselves. So the agency of Aboriginal people is central to closing the gap. Now, I think Pat Turner has really changed the face, the apparent face of the way governments are going to behave, but I don't underestimate that this will require unlearning centuries of how government has worked. Yeah. And your Aboriginal empowerment strategy is, there's another interesting example. Ben, as Minister, put out a discussion paper on the Aboriginal empowerment strategy, and it was full of that idea, which we all feel good about, that we want to empower Aboriginal people. But I think my own comment on your original discussion paper was that it said nothing about what government's got to do. Now, your final paper said a lot about what government needed to do, and I think that's the challenge of the next few years, is going to be to live up to what we've learned over 50 painful years. That's going to be a really big challenge for government. And in a sense, government can sabotage its own good intentions if it doesn't learn to work differently.
Yeah, often the biggest obstacle to good government is the government itself. Absolutely, and I say that knowing there are lots of heads of department here this evening. But on that, I mean, what we have now in Western Australia, nationally, is a growing, sophisticated Aboriginal network of whether it's Aboriginal medical services, education providers, etc. So we do have, if you like, an institutional architecture to call on. I look at, and I think this is what Ken Wyatt has been saying, and certainly I think you agree, is in terms of how a voice may present itself, is that architecture, particularly the native title architecture, may actually be a key part of that. Is that how you see potentially Linda Burney taking this?
If Linda continues the line that was adopted by the government that just lost, which was based on the work that we did under the chairmanship of Tom Karma and Marcia Langton, and it's quite a complex pattern, because what they're acknowledging is, there are a great variety of circumstances for Aboriginal people. There are all these hundreds of entities, and they're all different, and their circumstance. The people in the desert are very different from the people of the southwest, are very different from the people of the Kimberleys, and their circumstances, their history, their economies, everything is different. And so what is needed are local and regional voices that are tailored to the reality of each place, of each region. Now, in the case of Western Australia, native title bodies will have to play a big part, because a very large part of Western Australia is under native title, and no doubt you're very proud of that, and I'm very proud of it. I think it's terrific. But you've got these PBCs, prescribed bodies corporate, that are holding title. You've got some of them are struggling because they have no resources. Some are doing very well because they have got resources. And so each region is going to be quite different. The Noongar will be different from the desert. And the Yamatji, and there's a framework now for the Noongars with the Southwest Land Settlement probably, but the trick will be for governments to work with the communities to say what is the appropriate way to marshal the voice here. What are the appropriate representative of government, of Aboriginal communities, of Aboriginal organisations? Because all Aboriginal people want to be heard in their place. They're not interested in what's being said in North Queensland. They're interested in what's being said in Warburton.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings me, I think, perfectly to where I want to go now. A lot of your elected political career has been around the defence, if you like, of the remote communities. And for me, remote communities have always had to fight to justify their existence. Right? Doesn't matter, the reality is, sadly, who's in government. They've always had to justify this existence. I like to think we had a big fight over, you'll recall it, when there was the threat to closure and the description, I think, of people living in remote communities as lifestyle choices by the then Prime Minister, and then as a result of that, quite an interesting alignment of forces to support them. We've seen the state start to increase their investment in, not as well as they should, it's more around those relationships again. Do you think we are going to, people in remote communities are still going to have to continue to justify their right to live in these remote parts of Western Australia? Or is it something that's always under threat from the government of the day?
I'm a bit sorry you've raised remote communities, because this could be the point at which my language deteriorates. I'm desperately worried about the situation of the remote communities. In my view, for the last decade at least, and beyond that, really almost the last 20 years now, they have been treated brutally and cruelly, and they have been made less functional than they were 15, 20 years ago. And that has been because of the top-down intervention in the intervention, as it's called, which I think was brutal and totally not in line with what was recommended in the Little Children Are Sacred report. I've watched closely Commonwealth policy with respect to remote communities, and I think they have been, the word I use is cruel. the abolition of CDP, its replacement by a totally unworkable employment program, its replacement by then a further unworkable employment program, has weakened the fabrics of communities. The withdrawal of the Commonwealth from municipal services funding, the withdrawal of a lot of funding arrangements for remote communities has left them weaker than they were. And I think it's been a national disgrace. The one message I sent to Linda Burney after the election was, I said, please do not forget the remote communities, because they are out of sight. They're out of the mind, I think, most of the time, of the educated elite among the Aboriginal people, who are mainly in the southwest and the southeast, and they're almost an embarrassment. And I think what we badly need is a national policy which actually says something about the future of these communities and which sorts out the endless cost shifting between the state and the Commonwealth on these people. They are not treated as Australian citizens. They are treated, in my view, in a quite inhumane way.
And I think the irony, Fred, is when COVID was entering Australia, if you like, or certainly the government response to COVID, the thing we said about Aboriginal people is the safest place for you is back on country. And mobilised enormous efforts to take people back on country, and then, unsurprisingly, a lot of those communities didn't have the capacity to take people back. So I think, I agree with you, but I just think that has put governments, whether they like or not, in a position where they can no longer continue to delegitimise the existence of them.
Yes, I heard quite an amusing story about COVID yesterday, if there are amusing stories about COVID. I was talking to someone who's very active in the East Pilbara, so that's the big desert area east of Newman. And he said that COVID had got into some of the communities latterly, but they were now very well inoculated against it, so it hadn't an effect. And so there's a growing story among those communities that COVID's all right for us, it's only those white fellas that it hurts. so it's a new mythology that's emerging, that Aboriginal people are immune from COVID, and it's only those poor old white guys that are going to fall over.
Yeah, well, there's, I'm sure that'll continue to thrive, that particular story, as I try and get back out there. It's very difficult these days.
It is difficult, but I mean, it's a shame that Australians can't experience that. Because it is life transforming. I mean, it was interesting watching, I don't want to sound as though I'm in the pocket of the corporates here, but there's no doubt that mining companies have been in a position often to facilitate things more readily than government. And one of the projects I was involved in was the 10 Deserts project, which BHP funded across the 10 deserts of Australia. And it's based on those very successful Aboriginal ranger programs. And what fascinated me in dealing with the BHP Foundation on this was their absolute passion for this. And when we finally, after very complex agreements, because the foundation's an American foundation, you've got to deal with very complex American laws about the risk of there being criminal behaviour and so on. So very complex, but we finally got this agreement signed up for $20 million to go into this project. And the message that came was, it is with delight that we forward you this. And when we launched the program in the old Government House, the old Parliament House in Canberra, the chair of the foundation used exactly the same expression. She said, it is an absolute delight to me that we were able to support this. And that's because those people had been on country. Yeah. They'd been on country with people who had transformed their understanding of the link between Aboriginal people and country, to transform their understanding of how important this was and how important it was to the world, really. And so that's one of the really nice things. I mean, one of the dangers about this sort of conversation with an ex-minister, two ex-ministers you've got, so we are the most self-justifying people you'll ever meet in your life. Everything's lovely, we've fixed it. Well, we actually haven't. And I do think it's important to introduce into the conversation a note that there are some really, really terrible problems out there still. And you only have to look at imprisonment rates in Western Australia, you only have to look at child removal rates, you only have to look at the continuing disparities between education and health to say, jeepers, this movement has got a long way to go. And thank God there are a few younger people in the audience than me. Even young Ben here is going to be around for a very long time. But, you know, we've still got so much to do. And, I mean, there is that risk that even the successful Aboriginal community, and I'd put you in that category, using it, it's a simplistic term, but the people who are doing really well and contributing to Australia and running their lives and all the rest, there's this tale of people who are living in a situation of great disadvantage, and it's terribly hard to change. It's not a matter of just not, you know, we have tried to change ever since the Whitlam period, the Fraser period. There's been lots of honest efforts to change the things that are wrong, and we have to say, why haven't we done better? Well, Pat Turner's leading us into a better way of doing things. Your Aboriginal empowerment strategy is leading us into a better way of doing things. But the risk is that we'll lose focus. Now, the incoming government in Canberra, for example, is facing the most horrendous budget situation. If the Liberals had won the election, they'd have faced the most horrendous budget situation. How are you going to keep a focus on the ending of this really still very significant disadvantage at a time when generally Australians are saying, oh, gee, we're doing it pretty hard, you know, costs are going up, there's inflation, we can't pay our bills. That's all true. So how do you keep a focus on these remaining areas that really need attention? And that's why my simple message to Linda was, don't forget the remotes, but there are a lot of other things I hope they don't forget as well.
And I think that's, again, the reconciliation movement, I'd like to think is hopefully removed from government consideration a lot of Aboriginal spend as optional extras and therefore subject to those movements in the budget. Fred, as you go through the memoirs and as you read through them, people in the audience tonight, you'll see there are really key points in Fred's reconciliation journey. The Gove decision, a lot of it's built around land rights. Gove decision, your time as a young lawyer, the politicisation of Fred Chaney actually as a young lawyer, Nookanbar, Mabo, Native Title Act. And it sort of struck me that there's always a point, you know, whether it's a tragedy of John Pat, deaths in custody, Jukan Gorge, that seem at the time to set us all back, but ultimately has sort of ultimately pushed us all forward, the great nudger, Fred, that we're slowly getting better. So where you sit now, a long time in the reconciliation movement, sort of what's next for reconciliation? Not in the next 3 years with a referendum, but what's sort of the next part of this?
I think there are things that are predictable and things that, or they said, the things we don't know, we don't know. I think the predictable things are that we're going to have a genuine attempt to get constitutional recognition done this next Parliament. Yeah. The government's indicated that's its intention, and I think with the best will in the world that won't be simple, but I think it's going to happen. We're going to see the working through of the closing the gap partnerships, and I hope that everyone who's interested will keep a careful eye on this, because it's going to require constant pressure on governments to relearn the way they do business, and I think that's a really big challenge. So we'll know over the next few years whether we're making better progress in that. But in the really long term, I think there are some really things we can't know. Mabo was the big turning point in Australia's history as far as Aboriginal people are concerned, because 1788, they're sort of wiped off the map in terms of rights. They regain rights slowly with lots of battles. But Mabo is the big turning point in that the High Court recognised that there were rights that continued in existence, not because an Australian Parliament or government said they existed, but because they were there. So that common law recognition, that's what changed everything. The Southwest Land Settlement, the Yamatji Land Settlement, they represent so far high points of following that through, you know, and well done you for that. So what we have now are corporate entities which supposedly represent the collective identities of Aboriginal people who have a place, potentially a long-term place, as part of the structure of Australia. What I don't know, and I don't think anyone can know, is what are the choices Aboriginal people are going to make about the extent to which they are part of those structures and see them as acting out their being, in a sense, through those structures, as against what we won in the early parts of the reconciliation struggle, their equal rights as citizens of Australia. Now, what choices are people going to make? I mean, in a sense, you, Ben, are a classic example. You are totally successful in the wider Australian society. You've got a university degree from here, you've got a university degree from London, you've been very senior in government, you're now sitting on major company boards. So to what extent are your future choices going to be around your part of being an Aboriginal collective as against being a person of Aboriginal descent? And I think that's, I don't know, but if you ask me to guess, I would say that on all the precedent we have of the settler societies, the United States, Canada, settler invaded if you like, but let's not get into that for the moment. New Zealand, Australia, Scandinavia, the expression that appeals to me is that the native people have endured, and they have endured in their collectives, not just as individuals, even when they have full and equal citizenship. If that's the case, then the post-Mabo Australia will be an Australia where there's a continuing Aboriginal collective present as against an individual citizen presence. Now, this is actually a live issue. If you read The Australian this morning, which many of you won't have, poor you, there's a long piece by Greg Sheridan, which is really saying this is anathema. We are all equal citizens. And he says that Malcolm Turnbull got it right when he didn't adopt Uluru, because we're all equal citizens. And that's, I can't predict how that argument will work out. What I believe is this: yes, we are all equal citizens. We are all equally entitled, and a few Saturdays ago, we all got the same vote. I love election day in the sense that we all go along and we are all totally equal. One vote each. It's fantastic. And the result is dictated by us, the collection of our single votes. But the other truth is that we are in a country where there are collective identities, the Noongars, the Bari Jawi, the Mirwang Gadjurong, the Gidja, all around the country. There are all these people who have a collective identity and they have collective rights. They have rights not as individual citizens, but as members of that collective. And I don't know how robust that's going to be. I just don't know. But how robust it will be will depend in part on the individual decisions of every Aboriginal person. And so I don't think I'm going to live long enough to work out what's going to happen, but you might, to know whether, how it does all work out.
I think you've got plenty in you yet, Fred. Before I go to the crowd, the audience, so if you've got a question, I'm going to go to you in a minute. I'm just going to sort of take that to treaty. In Western Australia, we've often described the Noongar settlement and the Yamaji settlement as a treaty. Now, people have the term itself is contentious, right? How do you see that? I mean, this is, I suspect, this is going to play its way out a bit longer than a term of government, but are treaties individual agreements you see with governments and groups, or are you seeing something more grand with our sovereign national government and an Aboriginal collective?
I think there could be an argument for having the grand national treaty, if you like, or at least an authorising treaty, which is probably more likely. I mean, I think to be valid, treaties have to be with the Aboriginal nations. They can't be with the collective identity of Pan-Aboriginal, Pan-Aboriginalism or so. But I think, in a way, there's a risk of overcomplicating it. Mick Dodson did a paper years ago in the series that I think the ANU promoted, might have been IATSIS, about treaties, and he said, don't get too hung up on the word. And that was the plea that Malcolm Fraser and I made to the National Aboriginal Conference in 1980, where there was a lot of talk of treaty, and we said, look, for God's sake, can you find another word? Because Charlie Court here and Sir Charles Court here, sorry, I don't mean to be disrespectful, Sir Charles Court here and Bjelke Peterson in Queensland would just go absolutely manic, you know, and even more moderate chaps like John Howard would say you can't make a treaty with yourself. But the fact of the matter is that what is a treaty? A treaty is an agreement between sovereign states. Well, the South West Land Agreement is an agreement that was not made with 30,000 individual Noongars. It was made with the collective entities, the collective Noongar entities. It's a state government agreement with collective Noongar entities, and in a sense the Commonwealth's a party to it too, because the native title process. So I think that's a treaty in everything but name. And I don't think, you know, you can spend a long time having abstruse arguments about subordinate sovereignties and all that sort of thing. The reality is that this is a country which has within its boundaries historic communities which are now recognised as having rights that flow from their law and culture. They've flowed through. It's perfect for what I would call treaty making. Now, I don't know that a treaty has to go much further than the South West Land Settlement, the Yamatji Settlement and so on. That's a matter for the parties to determine when they negotiate. And treaties are renegotiable, so don't think that it's going to be done and dusted. It may well be that future governments will come back and renegotiate the South West Land Agreement, for example.
Well, a chunk of my time as Minister was renegotiating previous settlements. Absolutely.
That's right.
I came away from that burnt a few times, Fred, I assure you of that. Out-negotiated comfortably sometimes. Now, I can't see very well because of the lights, but I'm assuming that they're... Oh, we have an online question. Jodie.
Thank you, Fred and Ben. It's a fantastic start to the discussion. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. My name's Jodie Nunn. I'm the CEO at Reconciliation WA. It's lovely to have you all here. We do have some online questions to start the questioning while the crowd is warming up. So, question from Stephen. How do we ensure the rights of Indigenous Australians to their land, water, sea, country, and what happens on their country is not discounted and dismissed in Australia's efforts to meet our international sustainable development goal targets? The Climate Carbon Challenge and the Convention on Biological Diversity is 30% of the environment protected by 2030. Potentially, Indigenous Australians will be the most impacted if we don't act. Conversely, if we do act ignorantly and dismissively, they will also be the worst impacted.
Gosh.
It's a big question.
Fred.
Look, I think I've got a really good answer to this. No, look, I'm sorry, that's quite a complex question. And can I say that the reason I think I survived in politics is that I don't have a very complex mind. I actually have a quite simple mind. And so let me take what I think is a simple piece of that. One of the marvellous things about the management of the Australian landscape has been the meticulous way that it was managed by Aboriginal people. And you'll see this recorded in Dark Emu, but you'll see it recorded in, if you like, more Western terms by the world's biggest estate. Brilliant book by Bill Gammage, yeah, fantastic book. And one of the things that made Australia what it was when the British arrived, a land that was park-like, a land with wonderful grazing country, wonderful forests, was that it was managed. It was intricately managed by the use of fire. And so that was swept aside by the settlers, and as a result, beautiful pastures were invaded by woody weeds, fire practices fail, you get wildfires and so on. We're now moving back to Aboriginal style burning, a different pattern of burning. It's a slow, tortuous process rediscovering what was known for thousands of years. But in addition to that, one of the things that ranger programs are able to do in some parts of Australia, in areas, particularly in the north where there's at least 600, there's a certain level of rainfall that's required, is carbon farming. So the traditional methods of burning, in fact, enable the sequestration of much more carbon. And this is actually producing income for some of the ranger groups across the north of Australia. Now that is an example, I think, of Aboriginal land management and our hopes for the environment in the long term being totally complementary. So I think the conflict might not be nearly as much as the questioner is implying. And if I've totally misunderstood the question, don't be surprised.
If I could just add to that as well, this is not new to government and Aboriginal people in respect of that relationship. A great policy, I think, success has been the Indigenous protected areas, which has actually seen Aboriginal country regenerated in quite a stunning way, and in quite remote parts of Western Australia, but not just WA. So I think it was Stephen who asked the question. I think there's actually huge opportunity here to learn from, I think it's Fred saying, from those practices.
Thank you, Ben. We might turn to the audience, and of course, if our roving mics could put a hand up so we can see with the bright lights, that would be very helpful over there. Thanks, Holly. There's a question just down the front here, Holly.
Down the front.
Well, the roving mic's looking around. Just to follow up on Ben's point, I mean, the marvellous outcome of native title and the changed government response to it is the Gibson Desert Nature Reserve Agreement. It's a fantastic example where native title's been restored, there's a cooperative management arrangement in place, there's funding for continuing things. There are a lot of win-win situations here in the environment and
And that's, I agree. I don't say that because it was an important part of my time.
It was your time, yeah. Giving you credit, mate.
It was a fantastic agreement, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you both so much for the conversation. I'm going to pick up on a similar theme to Steve's question, I think, but hopefully in a slightly easier way. Fred, you talked about taking solace from feeling that the journey of reconciliation is inevitable in some way. And I wonder if you feel the same way about the future pathway of a social justice agenda more broadly. And I think that's what the question was going to in terms of the aspirations of the Sustainable Development Goals. How much is the success of the reconciliation movement tied up in the success of us grappling with these big justice issues more broadly? And do you share a similar sense of optimism for the pathway ahead for Australia?
Look, I think the essence of being a progressive, if you like, is that you believe that human progress is possible. The reason why you need movements is to turn the possibility into a reality. And you can't take any of that for granted. I mean, I think Australia has got the most amazing history of doing great things in a social sense. I mean, votes for women is one example. The living wage is another example. And that was really built into our system from, what was it, 1928, the harvester wage? You should know, you're the student. But anyway, fantastic sort of thing that, people were entitled to be paid a living wage. In fact, it occurred to me the other day, maybe the whole issue of wages ought to be going back to the harvester wage agreement or judgment. Maybe we should be thinking now more in terms of a living wage instead of the sort of what I think we've been led by economics and by the idea that competition is the most important thing of all, and that, what I'd call the more extreme end of liberal economics, that maybe we should be just saying, no, look, everybody's got to be paid a living wage. And that was In the old days, and you couldn't do this now, it was for a man who could keep a wife and children. Now, obviously judge the way you work that out now, but we do. The real answer to your question, Angela said, get out of politics, your answers are too long. And she's quite right. So to get back to your answer, I think progress will continue, but only if good people make the effort. I mean, the reason, this is not a political contest, but the reason I want to support my niece is because she wanted things to be better. That's the perpetual challenge for us all. And that's what we have to keep trying. And that's why reconciliation matters. It means that people come together with the avowed purpose of making things better. Our relationships better, our circumstances better. But it doesn't just happen. Because if you let it just happen, then all we know is that a few people run away with all the gravy and the rest are left with the crumbs. So it requires effort.
To add to that, Fred's, you make the point in your book, the status quo is so hard to move. It is so, and you can move it, and if you don't pay attention, it's like an elastic band. It springs back to where it was. You've got to keep pushing on it. So I just want to really emphasise that point, is that I agree, progressives agree, and that in human progress, but it's not inevitable. And the status quo is a tough beast to move.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience that we can see? Yep, just down the front here.
But when it does move, though, Irina, it's fantastic.
A question for Fred, and thank you very much for both of the conversations we've had. You mentioned about a sharing or a caring in Parliament, and this is one way that bills and acts can get through. Today, the new leader of the Country Party offered to accept some of the government's propositions and to be able to share. Is this true? Will it go for some, and will it go for the main ones?
You won't be surprised to know that the now opposition doesn't consult me very much. So I don't know, but I have been heartened by the fact that the new leader of the opposition has affirmed the need for a corruption commission. I have been slightly less heartened, but still a bit heartened by the fact that he has indicated that the sort of constitutional issue is not closed, so the door has not been slammed shut. That's good. And I haven't yet seen much of Little Proud. All I know is that Little Proud has to be better than Barnaby Joyce. But I'm sorry to make these political judgments. I mean, totally, but I do think Little Proud is a more centrist sort of person. And I think the other thing is that politicians respond, like the mining industry, they don't respond to spiritual conversion, they respond to force, actually. And the force is the electorate. And the electorate has made a really big decision in the last election that I think forces the members of Parliament to look at each other differently and to behave differently. So I'm a great believer in the use of force, and I'm very grateful that the Australian people actually imposed a bit of discipline on the major parties in the last election. And I'm a sunny optimist. I believe that nirvana is at hand, that all members of Parliament will love one another and shout hallelujah and find the right answers. But no, I do think things will be better.
Fantastic. Fred, before we round out and do a vote of thanks, I'm conscious that time is coming to an end, and I imagine many of you are wanting to warm your hands on that fire over there. I just ask you to reflect as a round out on your the wonderful chapter around the little nudger and what that could potentially mean for us all in the audience tonight.
Yeah. I'm going to offer some advice. If there are any young people here, I can't see any apart from my relations. I had a moment of real relief in my life when I went to the Hal Wooten lecture at the law school at the University of New South Wales years ago. It was given by Hal Wooten himself, and Hal Wooten is a giant of a man. He died just last year, aged 98. He was President of the Australian Conservation Foundation, QC, Judge, Royal Commissioner, Native Title Deputy President. He was all sorts of things. He was just but he had, this is what I thought of him. I thought if I could have a brain transplant, I would like Hal Wooten's brain. He just had the most wonderful mind. Hal, no, I've lost my track of thought now. Little Nudger. Hal gave this lecture and he said, I'm going to quote a bit of it. He said, I had a book of poetry called Other Men's Flowers. And I had that book too. It was all of the poems that Lord Wavell knew by heart, a very thick book. And he said, I have often borrowed other men's flowers, and one of the florists from whom I borrowed was Lord Diplock. And Lord Diplock said, it is not given to many to be able to say, as Lord Mansfield said, this is another great British judge, the air of England is too pure, the air of England is too fresh for a slave to breathe. Let the black go free. This was a judgment which said you could not have slavery in England. Diplock went on and said, for most of us, the best we can hope is that we can give the law a little nudge in the direction that it should go. And Hal classified himself as a little nudger. And I thought, I think I said, oh shit. I'm sorry, there, I knew I had to do it once. I've just felt this immense sense of relief because, you know, you spend your life trying and you often think you're not getting very far and you're not getting anything done. And Hal made me realise that that's the role of each of us. We are all people who give the world a little nudge in the direction we can go. Very few of us change the world in some dramatic way, but we can by joining with other people, whether it's in a reconciliation movement, whether it's in a political party, whether it's in a teal movement, whatever it is, we can nudge the world in a better direction. And I think that's a fantastic idea to keep in mind, because otherwise you get very discouraged, because the real problems are very big problems, aren't they? And you know, you've been in a position of great power, and yet you can't fix everything, but you can nudge things in a better direction. And that's, I found that helpful, and I hope other people might find it helpful too. And I tell you what, you keep nudging till you die. That's a good rule. Just keep nudging.
A wonderful reflection. Thank you, Fred. I'd now like to invite Karen Mundine, the CEO of Reconciliation Australia, to say some closing words this evening, but a sincere thanks to both Fred and Ben for this evening. Thank you.
I am going to keep these comments brief, but please, ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking Fred Chaney and Ben Wyatt for a fascinating discussion. Can I also thank Victoria Laurie for crafting such an important memoir when it comes to our reconciliation movement. My name is Karen Mundine and I am CEO of Reconciliation Australia. I'm a Bundjalung woman from northern New South Wales. This is a long way from my home, but whenever I am here on Wujak Noongar Budja, I feel very, very welcome. So I acknowledge the Wujak Noongar people. And I pay respects to elders of the past and those of today who are having a resurgence and a resilience that is so central and connected and strengthening of the reconciliation movement. When I was asked to speak tonight, and also thinking about this memoir, and I reflected on the fact that as Fred was entering politics, I was entering the world. And one of the things that I reflect on, and I think it's come up a couple of times in conversation today and also in the memoir, is these generations. I am forever eternally thankful, and I think about the many giants on whose shoulders I stand on. And certainly the work that you have done, Fred, the reflections that are in this memoir, but also your constant nudging to all of us is an inspiration. When I took over as CEO of Reconciliation Australia, our paths were just crossing. Fred was stepping down from the board as I was taking on a job, but nevertheless, I constantly to this day often think, what would Fred do? Whenever challenged or faced with a puzzle that won't quite be cracked, I keep going back to what would Fred do, and I think that's something that all of us can take away from that. You would have all received a copy of this amazing memoir when you first entered. There are additional copies, I am told, back that way where you first entered, and I encourage you all to get more copies purchased, send them around, give them as presents, because it is a story that is worth telling and spreading. Both aspects here at Karakumba and Kings Park and WA Museum Boola Bardip shops will be selling both memoirs in-store and online. So that is all that is left for me to say, except for an absolute sincere thanks to you, Fred Chaney, for all that you have done and all that you will continue to do for our community and for our reconciliation movement. You certainly provide inspiration to all of us here for this evening, and we accept your handover notes and your continuous nudging with much gratitude and appreciation. So thank you all for joining us this evening. Please travel safely home and stay warm.
I nearly forgot to swear, but even more important, I did forget to say thank you, Vicky, for your patience, Victoria Laurie, for your patience in putting this together and for the pleasure of your company in doing it. The other thing I want to say is that I acknowledge in the front of this document a handful of the Aboriginal people who have been the people who have inspired me and made me understand what I need to understand. And I thank them all for their patience with me and for their friendship. And I also thank a number of the non-Aboriginal people who have been an inspiration to me, including Hal Wooten, but there are others who have... my advice to the young is find people you admire and just try to live up to them. Thank you.